Okay, this will be like the little afternoon news update sometimes I do. It's very windy, so I had to get in the car. I did a little news on the teaching post. Now, some of you will see this a little later on YouTube and stuff, and you won't see the teaching post, which is I put on Facebook today. I won't post that to YouTube and all until that post goes up in about a week. But on an earlier video called Colossians 3, which is now on Facebook, I talked about briefly some of the world situation. But now I'll do a little bit more because this is like the daily update. As I was walking out here, I was laying down for a little bit, tried to just lay down on the concrete, and it's nice just sitting there. But as I was walking, I was thinking of a story that I posted a couple years back. And it had to do with one of the other areas of the world that we have been involved in, and it's Afghanistan and Pakistan and the Bin Laden and the Taliban, which you haven't heard a lot in the news, but all of the Taliban, of course, I know Laden is dead. But there was a kid that was picking up sticks in that area. And there's like a no man's land where the Taliban was functioning out of, between Pakistan and Afghanistan. One day the kid was picking up sticks with his younger brother, and we at the time thought it was one of the people, we couldn't tell the age, that were maybe engaged in like doing a landmine or something, and through a drone, I believe, we killed him, which was an accident, but he was targeted. Now, the U.S. military does not target children like that, and the U.S. military does not purposefully kill children. Though there were times in our history where we felt in order for the survival of our country, we did do that. And the most famous case is the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I'm not making it, I'm challenging mindsets. But in the case of the one I just gave you, that area of the world, eventually there were a lot of cases like that, and there were lawyers for the Afghanistan people and Pakistani kids. There was enough cases where they started trying to bring civil suits against the United States. And of course none of that ever goes anywhere, but they were collecting some of the things that kids that accidentally were bombed on. Most of us in the Western world, normally, a story like that passes us by without second thought. Now, this is what I would ask those of us in the United States and those in the Western world. Would you have preferred your own child, if they had experienced two things? They would either be killed, as what's referred to as collateral damage, and you never see your 10-year-old again. Or would you have rathered them to have had maybe a chemical exposure, which is wrong, and to actually have recovered maybe a week later from it? I guarantee you, most of you mothers and fathers, if you had the choice, regardless of who did it, if you had the choice, you would prefer your child not having been killed by a mode, a drone, or even a bullet, which is considered, quote, in the civilized world, an acceptable mode of death. But if I asked you today, you would pick, I'd prefer my child to have had a chlorine exposure and recover a week later than to have died. But yet, this is one of the things that you see in media that manipulates us. I'm against all of the killing, poisoning, poison gas, all of it. And I don't think the killing of a child by a drone, because there's an acceptable amount of collateral damage that we, the U.S., permit, though we don't target. But if you explained all that to that mother, in that one case I just gave you that just came to my mind as I was out here. So what happens in society is we use moral arguments, and the media does it, and says certain things are unacceptable. Why would I bring up Japan? It was simply because for the survival of what we felt was the world. And at that stage, there's a lot of questions. We targeted a lot of children. And just because estimates of 200,000 up to eventually through radiation poisoning and all those things, I'm just bringing it up because I don't think just about hardly anybody sees that as a moral outrage. Most in the Western world still view that as an acceptable thing that was done. But the way the media manipulates, they say, but what about your own people? This is a manipulation. Someone either kills or gasses their own people. Sadly, in the world, you had it in Libya, you had it in many places, and you're having it in Syria. You're having what's called a civil war. And people are rising up, and many of them righteously and justly, to overthrow their government. And when countries go through civil war, even if it was our country, if we ever had another civil war or an uprising where there were actually people on opposing sides armed that were in the U.S. trying to overthrow a government, sadly, we would not deem some of those casualties as the U.S. has targeted its own people. We would understand that there was an attempt through a particular faction possibly to overthrow the U.S. government, and in retaliation we went after people, not targeting their kids, but if there were cities and towns in the U.S. that the rebels were holding, and this was a real ongoing war. I don't think just about anybody who is outraged about, quote, Assad killing his own people. All of this is a manipulation to justify things. It is no more noble to shoot another person's child or to kill another person's child with a drone. It is no more noble than the atrocity of poisoning young people in your own country. It is no more noble. And that's the point I make when I look at the manipulation in society. Besides the question of whether or not it actually was Assad who did that. These are mindsets that we often don't challenge. And I can give you many other cases like that. I can give you many other cases. But most people in the West were outraged that there was a poisoning on children. And mark my words, there were many videos over these last 7 or 8 years I spoke about later that were shown to be propaganda. Many were shown to be props. Many of the kids in some of the videos that came across these last few years were shown to not be real. It's important to understand that before we get manipulated. Now, being I have it on the local news, I looked at pretty much all the news for the day. But the local news, out of all of our local media, the only one that had a unique story was the Kohler Times, and it had to do with our district attorney, Mark Gonzales. I actually reposted a video called The Mexican Moses, just because at the time it just happened to come up on a reposting, but I'm not going to do all that again. But the Kohler Times showed something that I thought was kind of a surprise. There was a cop who is still back on the police department, but this is out of Mathis, a city I go to every now and then. And he actually was charged with choking out a girlfriend, meaning choking her. that's not actually a misdemeanor domestic abuse. That's actually what's called a felony domestic abuse. And the reason the Kohler Times highlighted that is that officer also was not charged. And Mark Gonzales, Kohler Times showed correctly, when he came into office, he wanted to try and do things different. And one of the things he said was people that were charged with domestic violence abuse would have an opportunity to take a particular type of a course. And the effort, Mr. Gonzales's efforts, I'm sure were noble, meaning we're not going to really charge them with a crime. We're going to offer them particular type of courses so they wouldn't offend again. And if they finish the course, then they would, be able to not have the charge and everything would go away. A few things. The Kohler Times did mention that in this case it was a felony. And they spoke to the local domestic violence advocates, and they said a person that chokes out somebody else. I've had friends that have had these things happen, but a boyfriend or a husband who chokes out his girlfriend, they said that rises to a different level where they wouldn't even recommend like just a course or something. They said that's a higher level. That person's much more at risk of murdering. And they showed that he's basically a cop still. And our local paper did some things about judicial temperament. Nick Jimenez had a column on that. I'm going to compliment them now that I have this on. But if you're an officer, and it looks like Mr. Gonzales is going to maybe change some things, Mark Gonzales, the DA from Nueces County, because if you're an officer and you had an incident like that happen, what we also need to look at is police temperament. Many fine police officers have the temperament to be police officers. But someone that is maybe displayed that level of violence in a domestic situation should not be an officer, flat out. The other day I read a good article, and I was surprised the Kohler Times had it in an opinion piece. I spoke before the article came out in one of my criticisms of the Kohler Times, which have been many. I talked about the science of eugenics, a science that came up in the 1800s by a relative of Charles Darwin, famous for popularizing evolution, the theory of evolution. But eugenics was a science that basically said, if evolution, the way it was understood at that time, were true, say if we eliminated what they deemed the more inferior races in other ways, and then the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, who started the first one in New York City, had views of eugenics, meaning she felt like we should eliminate particularly the black race because many of them are having too many kids. That was her ideology. Now, I spoke on that. I'm wondering if they thought, or if they looked into it or whatever, because they ran a pro-life opinion piece and it talked about eugenics, and it was a woman that was knowledgeable about it, but she was challenging the mindset that said some countries are eliminating through abortion. I forget now if it's New Zealand, but one of the countries' goal is whenever a pregnant mother is diagnosed that her child has Down syndrome, they're now trying to eliminate Down syndrome children from the entire population. And the pro-life article that the Opinion Kohler Times ran showed that perspective from the woman that wrote it and said abortion, even for those who are pro-abortion, was never intended to be eliminate a particular type of person from society. So they covered something very rarely. They gave, I felt, a good opinion piece. And not too long after I read it, I forget where I was at. I went to Real Life Church, and there was a sweet young girl, maybe 10 or 12. She was young, and she had Down syndrome, and she was handing out a little church flyer. And I said, "Thank you, honey. Thank you, sweetheart." And I thought, how devastating would it be? Down syndrome people understand. They're wonderful people. And when she's old enough to read that there are some in society that wished to eliminate all people like her, So this is just a little update. I figured I'd mention that. That was the top of the news on the world thing Mr. Trump is holding up on the striking with the Tomahawk missiles on the military bases in Syria. And that this is to challenge mindsets. Remember that. Remember this. Countries that deem that there's a civil war in them, and there are many that are like that, at times, most people, we look at the tragedy of our civil war, which kids were indeed killed. Just about none of us, when we look at that history, would say Abraham Lincoln killed his own people. We very rarely look at it that way. Or that the South and the leadership of the South killed their own people. We very rarely look at it that way. And because we don't, we have a tendency to justify certain types of killing. And that story of that little Muslim boy who was picking up sticks, that was one of many cases. And we mistook. We thought he was in the field maybe planting mines or something. And his younger boy was there that day, his younger brother. That's not a noble, just, or good thing. And if I had the choice, would I prefer my young child at the age of 10 to have had a chlorine exposure, which at times we were trained about those things in hazmat and the fire department. I think everybody in this country would opt not for their child to die, to have had the chlorine exposure for a week and maybe to have recovered than to have been drowned. But there are many who are outraged that, quote, Assad would gas his own people, which is still questionable. But yet they're okay if a bullet went through the head of that child.